Hello, this is Eric Word Weaver Shervin. Today's entry is going to be a little bit of Storytelling 101. Over the years, people have asked me some tips and tricks on how to make their storytelling better and things that they can focus on that'll help their performance. Today, I think we're going to intro this with a little bit of organizational skills and some of the theory crafting that goes into some of the storytelling that I do. Now, when I first started storytelling back in the day, I made one of the major rookie mistakes that I see everybody start out with, and that is mistaking storytelling for story reciting. A lot of people will feel like they need to go through and memorize a story and then tell it word for word. Now, this has its place, don't get me wrong. The realm of poetry is very much the realm of recitation. This is an instance where every word matters, where you need to get the lilt, the cadence, the ordering right in order for the poem to continue to mean what it's supposed to mean and carry the full weight. With poetry is so specific on the meanings of words and the orders that changing that can completely change the meaning of a stanza. So, in those instances, memorizing a poem is very, very appropriate. Same thing if you're trying to recite something, maybe one of the stanzas from the Havamal or something like that. Memorizing and reciting shows a great deal of effort, a strong memory, and the ability to interpret that work and deliver it as intended. Now, storytelling is a bit different. The realm of storytelling is more organic. We go through and we weave a picture with words. We take a story and we bring it to life. And the thing about a living thing is it's never still. It's never one fixed point in time. The story itself is a living, breathing thing. And when you tell a story, that life has to be there. You have to breathe life into your story. So, one of the ways that I do this is I keep in mind I am telling a story. The exact details are not as important. The word for word recitation is not as important. So one of the things that I like to do when I go through and tell a story is I get to know the story. I get to feel the story inside. The gist of it is that you need to go through and read a story. If you're going to tell one that's already written, read a story. Get to know it, get to know the characters, think about the characters individually, and then put the book away. Set it to the side, and then tell someone, it doesn't matter who it is, family member, friend, whatever, whoever will listen, tell someone the Cliff's Notes version of the story. Think of it as a movie plot synopsis. You're just going to throw out real quick, this is what happened, then this happened, and it all came to an end. That is the beginning of storytelling. Create an outline. Now, when I go through and I write a story, I'll go through and I'll write it, I'll flesh it out and everything, but I always create an outline, a linear index of events and the orders that they're supposed to happen in. That's what I learn. I don't have to learn exactly what Arna said when he went into the woods, because I'll know it. The things that I need help remembering, that I need help keeping in order, is did he first go see the dwarf, or did he first go see the huldra? Which character did this character go to first? What order did these things happen in? Because you don't want to miss something that is important to the story later on. For instance, I learned the story of Butterball, one of my absolute favorite troll tales. It's an old Norwegian troll tale. I believe the translation that I have comes from a book by Moe and Asbjornsen. And it's a wonderful telling of this frolicsome little kid who is a bit problematic at times. He doesn't tend to listen to instructions well, and he's fairly impulsive. So, he runs afoul of this troll wife, and through a series of events, ends up going on a grand adventure. And then this is a coming-of-age tale. It shows his cleverness in action. It's humorous. It makes for a great story. Now, when I go through and learn Butterball, what I do is I go through and I read the story. And then I pick out key elements that I need to remember. Now, one of the key things in Old Norse literature, Northern European literature in general, is that things tend to be repeated in threes. That makes a very easy storytelling dynamic because you can always remember that things need to happen in triplet. And that's not to say all stories have to be this way, but as you'll see when you go through and watch the video on Butterball, he 3 times goes with the troll wife before things come to a head. So this repetition of 3 helps me to remember, okay, I'm on time 1, I'm on time 2, and now time 3. Pick details that serve as anchor points. You'll find in the story of Butterball again, there are specific silverware items that the troll wife tries to give to Butterball to lure him into her clutches. And so I know in the progression that we go to silver spoon, silver fork, and silver knife. This is our progression of 3, and this lets me keep the pattern going. This lets me keep the flow going without losing my place in the story. Now, in my Winter Night's Tale that I write about Arne the Ashlad, there again is a repetition. There's 3 items, 3 trials that he has to undergo before he can go and complete his quest. And there are key items that he has on his belonging, such as, 1, his long hair, gee, figure where I get that from, a silver coin that he keeps in his pocket that was a gift from his father, and a bronze hammer that he wears around his neck. Each of these items plays a key role in the story. I identify them early in the story and establish their importance by calling attention to them. Here is a little 101 trick. Do not focus over much on detail. All right, we're not writing a novel here, we're telling a story. You've got to impart an entire plot line in anywhere from a couple of minutes to maybe a half hour. Most people are not really interested in sitting down and listening to an hour-long tale. You will find instances where that is the case and people want to hear a grand ongoing epic. You do not want to memorize an hour-long epic. If you remember how things go from one to the next and can play it out in your head, then you can simply tell how you get from one to the next. A lot of storytelling is actually ad-lib. You pick the key details, like I said, the repetition of 3s, the key anchor items, and then you follow that pattern throughout the story until it reaches its climax. Now, with Arne and his items, I established very early on the characters at play and these items in particular. I call attention to them because they are important to the story as the story progresses. During each of the trials, there's a bit of where you have to figure out what is it that Arne is going to pay to pass this particular aspect of the trial. What's he going to sacrifice? And by bringing up these items early in the story, I have already clued you in to which ones they're going to be. And so the audience has the revelation, oh, it's going to be this, oh, it's going to be that. That gives them a bit of involvement. So lay the seeds early, anchor with key details, and then stay away from excessive details. We don't need to go into his sister Hilda and what color hair she has, what she's wearing that day. Those things do not matter in the grand scheme of the story. Only focus on things that actually matter to the story. Everything else you can flesh out as you go. The more details that you create for a story, the more you have to remember later on, and the more you can trip yourself up on. So try to stay away from excessive details and focus on the ones that are important. If you focus on those, that's less to have to remember, and you can really establish that pattern, because the only time coins are ever mentioned in my Winter Night's Tale are when I mention his silver coin in his pocket. I'll come back to it a couple of times to keep it in the listener's mind. But I don't introduce any other coins, any other payment. Nothing else is brought in. So we exist within the realm of the story. Keep it to what is important to the story. Don't bring in extra characters that you don't need. And if you do, leave them nameless. Like for instance, in My Winter Night's Tale, when Arna's father is having a feast, one of his men runs in and tells him of the abductions in the woods. It's the only time this guy ever appears in my story, and I don't name it, and I never mention him again. The men that go with the brothers on their errand are not named, specifically because they're not important to the story. If you'll go back and look at the Icelandic sagas, if you go through and read a lot of the folk stories, the only characters that are ever named are important to the story. If a person is named in a saga or named in a story, that they will play a part. And that for some reason, the storyteller wanted to record their name in that instance. Now, the sagas can be a bit misleading because a lot of people are named in the sagas, but everyone who's named in a saga has some role to play. And it may be short, it may be sweet and simple, but they have a role. The details kept to a minimum, the characters kept to a minimum. Focus on the plot and progress from point to point to point. When you set up your outline for the story, it's very much a logical progression of A to B to C. For instance, I start off a lot of my stories with point A being an introduction of characters. In My Winter Night's Tale, I go through and I introduce Arna the Ash Lad. I introduce his father, his two brothers, his two sisters, and their mother. In Butterball, we establish the main characters at play, which are the mother, Butterball himself, and the dog. Shortly into the story, we introduce the troll wife. These are the instances where you can describe someone. You set up their character by establishing, Butterball's mother is quite matronly and beautiful to look on. A few sentences, a brief introduction, but don't get lost in the details. Just give an overall picture of their character to set the context for their behaviors thereafter. You will paint the rest of their character through the storytelling itself. Okay? Like with the troll wife. When she first appears, we have a little bit of fun describing the troll wife, her hideousness, carrying her head beneath her arm kind of thing. But in the end, that's about as far as the descriptions go. We may call her terrible looking or the horrifying troll wife as the story goes along, but we don't focus on the details. I never go into what color her hair is, what is she wearing. The important thing is that she's ugly, she's terrifying, she is haggardly, and carries a sack on her back. These are key details that are important to the story. Anything else is superfluous. If I start bringing up necklaces that she wears, rings, baubles, trinkets, in anything more than generalities, I'm distracting from the story itself. If you get lost in the details, you will never drive the story home to where it belongs. Now, that being said, descriptions of these things can be beneficial to the story in establishing a character. For instance, if you have a character who is known for their opulence, who is known for their grandiosity, then describing the grand tunic that they wear that is bespeckled with jewels and is trimmed in gold, that flows about them like a royal robe. Now, a brief little snippet of that, just that little bit of descriptor, tells you a great deal about the character. So when you use descriptions like that, use them succinctly and use them to the point. The idea being that you are furthering the story or establishing character. Using these things in execution lets you progress a story, drive it on, and keep it on point. If you deviate from these things, you can get lost in it and you will lose the purpose of the story. This is another thing we need to talk about, the why of the story. Keep in mind that every story has a purpose, the moral of the story, if you will. Some stories are just that, they're moral tales. Some stories are coming-of-age tales. Some stories are adventures into the fantastic. It's a trial to be overcome. Some stories are origin stories. The idea is you have a starting point and you have an ending point. You have these plot points along the way, which you remember from your outline, and then you simply tell people how you go from one to the next. Keeping the verbiage appropriate for the audience is very important. You don't want to get so lost in your own vocabulary that you lose people. I, for one, am one that is given to that in normal, everyday conversation. I'll throw out big words all the time and then lose people and have to go back and explain myself. I'm sure most heathens understand this, because when you go out and you talk to a non-heathen and you want to drop a reference of Sigurd the Volsung, and you talk about some great trial in your life as going through the flames to find Brunhild. Those that are heathen and have read the Volsunga saga know what I'm talking about. Any of you that are not familiar with that particular work are completely lost. You know, if I'm talking to another heathen and I bring up my luck or my worth, they get it because they have the context. They understand the terminology. Outside of that, it becomes jargon and people get lost in it. So, as you are telling a tale, you are tailoring it to the audience. Okay? Let's focus on this a little bit. This is the actual art of the telling of the tale itself, the weaving of the spell. Eye contact, of course, is extremely important when you're going through a crowd. Make eye contact with the individuals that are there. Draw them into you and tell them the tale. As you're sitting there telling your story, one, I recommend standing if you can, because it allows the energy to flow a little bit easier. Two, focus on a single individual at a time. In grand sweeping movements, especially during transitionary actions, you can sweep across the audience and tell it to the whole, especially in things that are grand entrances or sweeping announcements. But to really drive home the emotion of a moment, to really connect someone with the character, focus on a single individual in the audience, look them in the eye and tell that one person that story. Lose yourself in it a little bit and tell them that story. Tell them that point. Then, as you break in the sentence and you have a hiccup, a simple verbal pause, switch to the next person. And when you're done with that, you look to someone else. Bounce around the room, but make sure to create lingering eye contact with each individual in the audience routinely throughout the story. Now, if you have a huge audience and you're performing on a stage, it's a little bit more difficult. You have to work with what you have and find the anchors that you want. These moments of eye contact serve a couple of purposes. One purpose is to draw the audience in and make them a part of the story, because it's through the eye contact and through the sound of your voice that you cast the spell. It is very much casting a spell. You are captivating them and you are holding them in a holding spell, and you are weaving a picture in words in their mind. The second purpose that the eye contact serves is to create more anchor points for yourself. Because as you go about, if you're weaving back and forth throughout the audience and you're not making individual eye contact, you can get lost in the story. Focusing on one individual, making lingering eye contact, even for the briefest of moments, recenters you on what you're doing. It's not just a performance, because we can stand and do theater all day long. People can come and look. Good actors will draw people in. The greatest actors will make people feel like they're truly a part of it. But that's not specifically what this is. This is storytelling. This is a give and take between the audience and the storyteller. And that eye contact reminds you what you're doing. It'll cause you to slow down when you need to slow down. It'll cause you to drive home an emotion when you need to drive home an emotion. These tricks will help you to deliver it more freely and a little bit more organically. Okay? So, work the audience. Listen to the audience. And by listening, I know they're not speaking, you're the one speaking. If they're talking during your story, you haven't woven the spell correctly and you haven't gotten them captivated. I have stood in front of a room of 200 heathens and silenced a room with a story. A lot of you were there. It was fun. I loved that story. That was a great telling of Butterball. I had so much fun with that. But they're not speaking to you when you are listening to them. You are listening to them through their energies. You are listening to them through their eyes, through their facial expressions, through their body language. As you tell the story and you find people that are leaning back in their seats, maybe looking off in the distance, things like that, that's a person you know you need to draw back in. So you make eye contact and you tell them the story for a minute. And then you find another and you pull them back in. But you can't ignore those individuals that are enthralled or you will lose them. So the ones up front that are leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching your every movement, listening to your every word, look to them and make them a part of it. Draw them in. Then you'll have them. Keep them woven in as you go through and you leave the crowd. I would say that better than half of storytelling is reading and working a crowd. The actual telling of the story is the easy part. Anyone can stand up and tell a story. People do it all the time. Anyone can do this. Anyone can do this as well. Work the crowd. Look to the audience. See where they're losing attention. See how they respond to certain things. If you've got a younger audience, if you've got a particularly lively audience, a light-hearted audience that responds well to character voices, that would be a time to bring in character voices. That would be a time to over-exaggerate the troll wife as she talks and to create this character in their mind. If you've got a group that's more somber, more solemn, a little more serious, you're not going to get the same results by busting out with the troll wife voice, the high and squeaky, or pushing accents with different characters. Then you pull back from the dialogue and focus on telling the facts, the details, not so much on the details, but the overarching facts. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. This will keep things flowing and keep them engaged. Okay? And try to gauge when the energy is letting off and when you need to infuse some energy, like a shot, into the audience. Pick up your volume, change your cadence, move about more, create energy in the group to pull them back in. They're not going to watch a deadpan performer. He will lose the audience in a heartbeat. You can be the most beautiful woman in the world, and if you want them looking at more than your pretty hair, you're going to have to work the energy. You're going to have to work the room and make it about the story. You can be a big, gruff, manly man whose commanding presence brings all eyes to him. But if you want them to actually hear what you're saying and be a part of the story, you have to work the audience. The tools of the trade. Okay? One of the main tools of the trade, I guess the key tool of the trade, of course, is your voice. Learn your voice. Know where your sweet spot is, where your comfort zone is. We all have a wide range of tones and pitches that our voices can create. And sometimes in daily conversation, we will change them throughout the day, depending on our energy levels, our moods, who we're speaking to. I, for one, know that anytime I answer the phone, my voice drops an octave. So anytime that I have to stand up and do any of my boss work at work, I've got to come out with a little bit more of the deep and booming voice. To tell a story, you need a voice that is something that can draw them in. It has to be comfortable to you. It has to be close to your normal speech patterns, close to your normal lilt and cadence, but not quite the same. Because it is other. If you're just going through and talking like you would any other day, it's part of conversation. It's easy to lose someone. To truly cast the spell, to weave it, to pull them in, there has to be a little something extra. You have to find that certain something in your voice. And when you find it, when you can feel the energy flow through you, you know you're in that spot where you're giving and they're giving. And we're part of the same spell. That's where the magic happens. So, it needs to be a voice that you're comfortable in speaking in for long term. You may have incredible character voices, but character voices tend to be more strenuous on the vocal cords. If you have a story that's going to run 15-20 minutes, you've got to be able to speak for 15 to 20 minutes straight without losing your voice, without necessarily needing to pause for a drink. You need to be able to keep it up. You need endurance of voice to be able to make it. So it needs to be something that's comfortable for you to speak. It needs to be close to, but again, not exactly your normal speech patterns, your normal voice, because this is not your normal conversation. This is something a little bit different. It needs to be something you can flow from one accent to another if you're going to do accents within a story. Back to the detail aspect, I do not overly recommend focusing on accents unless you're good with accents. If you're good with accents, it's a great way to add flair to characters, to develop certain aspects of the story, especially to give a hint of, if you've got a leprechaun in your story, being able to go into an Irish accent, very, very helpful. But if you're not 100% confident with your accent, more often than not, you are going to fall flat on your face with it. The voice needs to be something that can transition well between whatever character voices you choose and back to main storytelling. You've got the narrator voice, and then you can create voices for the different characters. Now, even if you don't go through and create voices for the different characters, a simple change in pitch can effectively do what you need it to do. What you're doing is you're establishing a break between narrator and character. And the more stark the change, the more evident it is we're shifting from narrator to character. Okay? So, if you're speaking about, say, Bjorn Thorolfsson, the father, and Arne, the Ashlad story. If I'm switching to Bjorn, and I'm telling the story, I'm going through, and I'm speaking of Bjorn saw this, and Bjorn saw that, and then Bjorn stood forth and said, "Lo, here I need you to hear me." Okay, yeah, I slip into the accent. I can't help it, I do that. But, you notice, voice drops just a little bit. It's just enough to establish this is other than the narrator, okay? If you're going to talk about the daughter, you're talking about little Hilda, right? So you're going to go through and talk about Hilda. And Hilda, she went off, told Arne that he needed to follow her this way. A little bit of a lift is all it takes to say this is other than the narrator, and this is softer, this is feminine, without necessarily trying to affect an effeminate character, okay? If it's a comedy, yes, overly exaggerating the effemination of a character can be great for the laugh. Again, it's the purpose, the why of the story. If you are simply trying to develop a character, then overly exaggerating or trying to affect cross-gendered voices too much can actually break the story. It becomes comedic when it's not meant to be. Now, some people are just gifted at it and can shift from one to the other, and it helps to weave the story. But more often than not, I find too stark a difference in the voices, too much of a break can lead to disruption in the flow of the story, and people can get lost in it. Now, again, not everybody's this way. I actually recommend for most of my stories, because I tend to go more of a saga-style telling, to try and stay away from too much dialogue, okay? Smatterings of dialogue here and there, fine. They help to to give a picture of what's going on inside the character's mind, and it's essential sometimes because you need to say Arna said this, or the troll wife said this. Those instances, it very much helps to establish the character. It establishes the moment. It transitions from one to the next. Very, very helpful. However, prolonged conversation between characters becomes farcical in excessive use. So I recommend staying away from extended conversations within the story. One, they can become very difficult to follow. Two, they become very strenuous for the storyteller because you're overtaxing your voice, shifting from voice to voice. Now, with practice, and especially if you establish character voices that are not too much of a strain on your natural voice, you can do this and you can bounce back and forth for a little while. The longer you push it, the closer you establish farce. So I would recommend trying to stay away from those things. The next thing I would say, in following through with the voice and with the vocal range on the characters, is to know your own limits. Know how long you can go, and do not overtax yourself. It gets a little bit difficult when you're going through and you don't know exactly how long you can speak. If you set up to try and tell an hour-long story, but you've got a 30-minute voice, then by the end of the story you're raspy, you're choking, you're cotton-mouthed, you're trying to get it out, and it disrupts the flow of the story. If you end up knowing that you are coming upon the edge of your limits, truncate the story. Skip a few things here and there. Remember, the details are not the super important part. The meaning of the story, driving home the purpose of the story, this is important. Don't get so lost in trying to tell the story perfectly that you ruin the telling of the story by overtaxing yourself. Know that, if you've got about a 30-minute voice, you need to wrap up a 30-minute story and choose your subject matter more appropriately. Okay? All right. Now, I can go on for quite some time with varying details about this and that, and I intend to in future videos, provided that you guys like this. If you like this video, give it a like in the comments section, drop me a note, with the old thumbs up, and let me know what you think. This channel is going to be a mixture of storytelling, of some storytelling 101 aspects, and some other videos that just happen to strike my fancy at the time. So, let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, we'll work together and we'll come up with more good content, and I think we'll have a great deal of fun together. So, in the meantime, see you later.